Essentially, Hana is just going to describe an incident that happened with D&D and her, and it has to do with the Cersei storyline and the Sparrow storyline. Long story short, it's that Cersei is going to take vengeance, and apparently the original idea was, well, essentially it was less physically taxing, but D&D decided to do something much more drastic. And I think what they did does qualify as abuse. But, and this is I think where it's significant, Dragon Demands thinks what happens with Emilia Clarke in the final season counts as abuse. I disagree. I do think D&D did a lot of unethical stuff, and you can definitely say they were jerks or inconsiderate, or they did act in a certain way evil, but I don't think what they did qualifies as abuse, but what they did with Hana does count, and we're going to hear her speak, and it's a very harrowing experience.
That had me wondering, because I was reading that her demise originally was way worse than what we saw in the final product. So I guess, dare I ask, what could be worse than what we saw?
She was meant to be raped by the Mountain. And I think they'd had so many complaints about the rape of Sansa that they chose not to go with it. But unbelievably, they changed it quite at the last minute. I think they possibly changed it when I was midair flying to Belfast, because suddenly I got sent these new sides that said that I would need a wetsuit top. And I thought they'd sent me the wrong bits. And sure enough, when I got there, I was then put in a wetsuit top, and I was like, and they went, oh, it's waterboarding instead. And I was like, oh, but we're not actually doing waterboarding. No, we are. And there I was, strapped to a wooden table with proper big straps for 10 hours. And definitely, other than childbirth, it was the worst day of my life, because Lena was uncomfortable pouring liquid in my face for that long, and I was beside myself. But in those moments, you have to think, do you serve the peace and get on with it, or do you chicken out and go, no, this isn't what I signed up for, blah blah blah? And then the funny thing was, after we'd finished shooting it the whole day, and people like Miguel Sapochnik, the director, by the way, walking past with a cup of tea and a sandwich on the go and going, hi Anna, you all right? And I was like, not really. I've just been, the crew have just been saying we are actually really waterboarding you here. And I was like, yep, you don't need to tell me that. When I got back to the hotel that night, I was going up in the lift, and I was standing next to Eugene, who had to crawl through loads of shit to get out of the Sept of Baelor. and he was like, oh my God, what happened to you today? I could barely speak because I'd been screaming through the Mountain's hand, which is quite frightening as a singer, to completely lose your voice. So I had no voice at all to barely whisper, bruises already coming up like I'd been attacked. And I was like, I've basically just been waterboarded for 10 hours. And he went, mate, I've just been crawling through shit for 4 days on my elbows.
The grisly details, I think, are pretty obvious, namely that they were going to have her being raped by the Mountain, but due to criticism of the Sansa story, they decided to pull back from that and said, okay, we're not going to do that, but we're going to waterboard you instead, which on many levels sounds insane. Like, why would you think raping would be too much, which obviously would be hopefully fictional, right? They're not actually going to act it all out in real life, but then with this, they're going to use waterboarding as the substitute. But I want to be careful, because Hana herself does not say it is abuse. She understood their reasoning. She agreed, saying, okay, yes, Cersei would have to do something very extreme because she's very evil and she wants vengeance and all those kinds of things. However, she also says she did become really traumatized after this, and that she still suffers from episodes because whenever she sees something that reminds her of this, it's too much for her. Again, you can kind of take this two ways, that D&D are artists. I don't want to say they're good artists, but as artists and writers, they should be given full creativity. And again, I'm not really concerned with them, but I'm concerned with George Martin, because Martin has often been criticized for, quote, sexual violence. But I stick up for him. I think that that's totally legitimate. As a writer, he should be given 100% control. We shouldn't be that critical. You can still be critical, but he has a right to do what he wants. If we're going to say that, no, D&D shouldn't be allowed to do this, then it's like, well, what about George? I mean, George does do a lot of questionable things in the books with sexual violence, and you have to say, just be mature about it and just try to read it carefully, and that's it. If you don't like it, don't read the books, but don't censor him. But it's like, well, we can't have a double standard. So I would say, okay, the issue is not, quote, the sexual content. That's not the issue. The issue is you're dealing with performers, and we can call you an auteur, we can call you an artist, but there are still certain limits. Again, what those limits are, it's very, very hard to outline, but this actually provides good benchmark saying, well, I think this is way, way too much. If, yes, okay, fine. Maybe they should have waterboarded. Okay, that's fine, but 10 hours? 10 hours straight? That's really physically way too much for any performer. And there was also really ugly hypocrisy because Miguel, he wasn't getting harmed at this. And Dan and Dave were definitely not being harmed during all this. They were not sacrificing anything at all. This is way too much of a demand to make on a performer. You can understand their reasoning, and ironically, the feminists are sort of to blame for this because they were criticizing the Sansa thing, and they were like, okay, fine, we're going to get too much flack for the Sansa thing again, so let's do something else. So it's sort of like, okay, now I'm not blaming them, but that's why they did it. They didn't want to do the rape thing again, so it's like, okay, we want to do something else. And either side you take, it's really disturbing, because do you want to defend them using rape by the mountain? And it's like, well, yeah, because they should be given artistic license. Now, you can still say they're going to mess it up and do a really bad story. I think that's probably what would have happened. But nevertheless, for the performer, it would have been physically less taxing. So we're sort of stuck with this dilemma. I think you can sort of say, and we're going to get into this, that they'd sometimes asked for things that were way too physically demanding, and there were alternatives. Like with the waterboarding thing, they could have, they might have had to use some of it, like with a real person in a real body, but just use green screen and try to use both methods. Just try to green screen a lot of it. And yes, if you have to, use the real person. So Hana being waterboarded to some extent, I think, is legitimate. But for that many hours, that seems way, way over the line. But then it's like, okay, but what's the difference between this and Amelia Clark? That was also physically taxing. And that's true. We've heard from her own testimony. She was shocked about the script she was reading and what she would have to do. But that's a mental, emotional thing. And although it's never easy to draw the line, because I actually support Charisma Carpenter with Joss Whedon, I do think what he did does also count as abuse. There's still a major, major difference that Charisma felt physically ill afterwards from her experience. Amelia has said she has felt some physical symptoms and things like that, but it's not to the same degree. And also, she was compensated quite lavishly. So on the one hand, yes, you want to say they did something wrong in deceiving her, but physically speaking, she just had to, talk to some green screen thing, and she had to mount a fake dragon. So, I mean, yes, it's tough because of what she was doing in terms of the script, killing civilians. And even in the original script, she was doing that. But it's like, okay, that was terrible what happened to you, but legally speaking, they didn't really do anything wrong. Here, I think this is really borderline, because even if the rules allow them to physically hurt a performer, they should not have done that. They should have been much more considerate. They should have really given her more time. There should have been more preparation. There definitely were different things they should have done, but they didn't do it because, they abused their power and they were just egomaniacs. I think this is a tough one, but I think this would count as abuse, and I think here they can be criticized going too far. We have a dilemma here that they were responding to kind of fan demands. So it's sort of like, well, even with the fan demands, I think the demand was basically try to do something else, try to do something more creative, and with this they could have done something more creative and still, yes, made some physical demand, maybe waterboarding for like 2 to 3 hours, right? That's still a lot of footage, but 10 hours, I think, again, we can never come up with a magical number, but I think that's way, way too far. But we're going to get more into how can we be critical of D&D without invoking a double standard and yet allow, in principle, a lot of artistic license. It's not easy, but I think, unfortunately, this case study is very valuable to get that right in terms of are legitimately angry with what they did, but not go further than that. This has been GRRM Analyzed on the difficulties of the Hana case.